What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to talk about an overlooked section of the lake that holds a ton of bass in the fall that receives very little fishing pressure, despite the fact that the fish are very easy to catch. Whenever I go out to the lake in the fall, I see a ton of anglers going into the backs of major creeks. A lot of anglers know that shad start migrating into the backs of pockets and coves, and so you'll have anglers all over the banks and the backs of these smaller pockets and major creeks all across the lake. Problem with these creeks is that they're relatively wide and they have a lot of bank for these fish to get in, so it's really hard to figure out where the fish are going to be setting up. And a lot of times they're setting up in these areas almost at random because they're following the bait fish, the shad, whether that's gizzard shad, threadfin, alewife, things like that. And what you'll find then is that day to day even, it's hard to track down where these fish are, or even hour to hour, and it can be even pretty difficult to establish a pattern at times. Therefore, I don't always just go straight to the creeks whenever I'm trying to find fish in the fall, especially if I don't have a lot of time to practice or I don't have a lot of familiarity with the lake. Instead, what I'm going to do is actually find the river section of the lake where it's the narrowest and kind of the shallowest, way up here. Right now I'm looking at Lake DeGray in Arkansas, and this is a section of the lake where I've caught a ton of fish in the fall. And when you go up to the section, you can see that it is initially semi-wide, and then it starts to narrow down and continues to narrow down. And really, the section I really focus on is actually right where it gets to the point where it looks almost like a river. And I'm going to show you what this looks like on Google Earth really quick. If we transition over here, we can see what this will look like. So you can see that we have some clear water down on the lower end, sometimes 5-6 feet of visibility, and then we have some more stained water in the mid lake, and then it gets all the way up here to this river section, which is super muddy. And if we get into this section and look, we can see that there's some pretty interesting things. One, you can see the water's pretty low on this lake, and that's pretty typical in the fall. You'll get those fall drawdowns, but whenever that lake starts getting drawn down, what that's going to do is cause current to get hit against these channel swing banks. So as you can see, we have these banks where you have a flat on one side of the a little river, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, the main lake, the river, and then you have this steeper bank over here. And there's always going to be this transition where the creek channel is swinging into this bank right here, and you have a flatter section and then you have the steeper section. And these transitions from the flatter banks over here to the steeper bank over here is where a lot of these fish are going to be setting up, because the current is going to be basically pushing through this river. And I'm going to draw with a little line. It's basically going to run through here, hit against this bank, loop back around, and it's going to then come back this way, hit against this bank, so on and so forth. So that's kind of how that current is going to flow. And what's going to happen with that is these fish are going to set up a lot of times right where that current makes the turn. So right on this transition here and this transition over here. That's kind of your key sweet spots. And the nice thing about this is that if you can find some bait fish around these walls, you're going to really not have that much water for these fish to be able to get in. They can't spread out all over the place. It's basically, they're going to be on that transition, they're going to be a little bit off the bank, or they're going to be on the other side on these flats over here. So what you can do is fish this transition area, maybe fish 2 or 3 of them, one over here, and keep rolling. And if you don't get bit on a couple of them, just come to the other side of the river here, or the little bank, and fish any shallow laydowns, grass, anything else you can kind of find in this area that those fish could be related to. And usually they're going to be on one of those 2 things. You can continue to run this pattern actually all the way up these rivers, and you can find another, again, little transition right here with some chunk rock. It swings back around right here. I just know from fishing this, there's a nice long bluff wall here that then swings away. There's another rock transition right here that swings in, and you can just keep running these transition banks all the way up until you run out of water. And I have fished all the way up at times, depending on the water level and stuff. With me, I've been all the way up to like here before, and sometimes it gets too shallow where you can't make it up there. But what you'll find is that in these little zones like this, you'll catch 2-3 fish per transition or per little bank. And you can catch them on the shadier banks on top waters. You can catch them flipping a jig if you wanted to slow down when it gets sunny. And sometimes you can even find them on these opposite sides, kind of against some of these semi-deep banks, just flipping little laydowns and stuff. So there's all kinds of good water to fish back up these rivers. And you're not going to have like miles and miles of river, and this type of area doesn't necessarily always hold a lot of fishing pressure. So if there's like 7 or 8 guys fishing this, it can get beat up pretty quickly. But if you're the only one in this zone, you can absolutely light it up. Now, this doesn't just apply to these highland, lowland reservoirs. You can also make this happen on river system lakes. So for example, if you wanted to go to Lake Dardanelle up here, this is more of like a river system-esque lake where you have a bigger section of lake down here where you have, I guess, more of a normal lake setup. But then up the river, again, you have this long stretch of main river, and you can even replicate this on just regular stretches of the Arkansas River or other river systems as well. And what you'll find is that the same thing applies. You're going to have areas where that creek channel is going to swing in and out of the bank, and it's a lot of times going to swing up against the actual bank itself. Like some of these banks, you can see it's very flat and nothing's really going on here. And then all of a sudden you'll have a stretch where it gets a little bit rockier, and you'll have this transition from this little sandy, more flat bank to a steeper rocky bank, and they'll set up on these transitions here. But you can also find a lot of these fish setting up around the ends of jetties on the opposite side. You have little small jetties that are made to protect from erosion against the bank. And because these rivers are so narrow, it's pretty easy to pattern them, because really you can fish some of the flatter sides with the jetties and then some of those steeper transition banks. And once you start establishing that pattern, you can just run every single transition along one of these main outside banks or the tip of every jetty in a certain section of the river and absolutely hammer them. Now, one thing about this is that you will find there will be certain stretches of the river that are better than others. And it's really interesting actually in the fall. What will happen is these baitfish will migrate, I find, almost like up and down this channel more so than back into the creeks. And this is something that's semi-specific to the, I guess, the river system type lakes like a Lake Dardanelle, Arkansas River situation. So it doesn't happen on every single lake, but if you do have a longer stretch of river, this is like 5 miles, 6 miles of river, you'll find that usually there's about a 1 mile stretch. So maybe you'll get in here and you'll find that like this 1 mile stretch has the majority of the bait fish activity on the main river. And then you'll find that every jetty, for example, is going to be holding fish, or every transition from kind of one of these. Let's try to find one over here. It's kind of a weird setup on this river because you have all these jetties in combination with everything. But here's kind of a bank where you can kind of tell it transitions. It's flatter mud here, and then it's going to transition. The channel swings in right here to a steeper rocky bank. It's kind of hard to tell. I just know from fishing this river where that's at. Our situation kind of happens right here where you have these flatter banks with these jetties, and then you transition into some steeper banks in through here. When you get to like here, it's a little bit steeper. Then it gets flatter again. Hopefully this all makes sense. And you'll find that within this little zone here, all of the bait fish are going to be packed into that 1 mile zone, and you're going to catch a bunch of fish in that zone. But once you leave the zone and move, let's say, a mile away from it on either side, you're going to get a lot fewer bites. So what I try to do when I head to these river systems in the fall, and again, anytime end of September through almost like November, I'll be looking for that 1 mile stretch of river, trying to figure out which side of the river they're on and try to replicate that pattern. And I might have to run 6-7 miles of the river because maybe I start on this end and I have to run all the way up, and I finally figure out they're like in this last little 1 mile stretch right below the dam. So it can get a little bit tricky sometimes, but it definitely works out. And this doesn't just apply on, again, like Arkansas River or lakes over here in Arkansas. If we go over to some of the lakes here in Tennessee, Alabama, places like that, we got Lake Gunnersville. There was a really big Bassmaster Elite Series event that was scheduled in the fall a few years back, and the winner was actually catching his fish way up the river up here on Lake Gunnersville, like way up the river. And what was happening is the exact same situation I just kind of laid out. You have these main lake banks. Some of the banks are flatter, some are steeper. So you can see right here, there's actually some main river grass. So this is a nice flat bank with some grass here. And there's a steeper bank on the other side. And to my best knowledge or my best recollection, he was catching his fish, the guy who won the tournament, kind of on those transition zones where you had some of this grass where it was relatively flat, and then it steepened out, and that channel swung up against the bank, and he was just running those same exact transitions that we showed earlier that had the rock, but it was like a grass transition where there was a harder grass edge or a grass line, and that channel basically again will swing in kind of right through here, and then it'll swing out and meet the other side. And so right on that little bend, the sweet spot in here is this right here, is kind of that little sweet spot, because that's where the current flows. It's going to flow in, hit that area, and then flow out. So whenever you have, again, current in the fall where they're pulling the lake down, or just in the fall in general, this is where these fish are going to be setting up. And the current does play a big factor at times for positioning those fish, but I find that you can catch them there even without the current at times. If there hasn't been a lot of current for 2-3 months, a lot of times they'll still set up here regardless. Now, there are fish that push back in these creeks and coves, and you may be wondering, okay, what about the backs of these pockets and creeks? There are fish to get back there. Problem is that they're a little bit harder to kind of figure out because there's so much backwater to cover, and the fish back in here might be setting up, for example, in like this little ditch right here. And so maybe you can pull up here, or maybe on this outside grass edge or whatever, and you can smash them, but they could also be on this grass edge or this grass edge, and it might take you an hour and a half to 3 hours to fish this one backwater, and it could have nothing in it because you're in the wrong stretch of the river. Versus on this main river stretch, you can basically roll through here and you can fish this little bend, run to the next little bend, and you can just hit those key sweet spots very, very fast and not waste a ton of time in dead water. And you're limiting the amount of water you have to actually check by going to these really narrow sections of your lakes. Now, the same thing applies, I'm going to keep rolling around, same thing applies on some of the lakes down in Florida and things like that, where you have little rivers and things that run into your lakes. So if you come over to some of these, I'm not a big Florida expert, so let me try to find one of these situations for you guys really quick. But a lot of times you'll have these little rivers that feed these lakes, and these little rivers that run in, you can actually run up into these rivers. I don't know if this is actually one of them, but I know that guys will run up into these rivers, and there's been some times when guys catch a lot of really nice fish, even on Florida lakes in the fall, running into these little rivers and these little channels and cuts and things like that. And I'm not going to go spend too much time on this because I'm not a Florida guy, I'm not a Florida expert, but I have heard it happening that you can find some fish in these little rivers and in these little channels that feed these lakes. So it sounds, at least from what I've heard from other guys, that this is kind of a consistent pattern throughout the entire United States. The one thing I will really warn you about is that, like, a lot of times, even when I'm up here on Beaver Lake, it's easy to run out of water. So this is when the lake's really high. I was up here the other day fishing, and on beaver I was catching them really well. Just a few days ago, caught like 20 fish on a whopper plopper up this river, and I made my way all the way up to here, and I could have kept going. I just stopped, and I made it all the way up to here and was catching them. And depending on the water level, you can keep going for a pretty good ways. But the problem was there was another couple people up here with me, even during the middle of the week, so they obviously knew what they were doing up here, and it really limited the number of spots I could fish. I kind of had to hopscotch around over different people, and it was a little bit tricky. So if there's a lot of fishing pressure in these areas, it could be kind of hard. You may have to really dial in your baits, your retrieves and things, but there's usually enough fish up here that you can at least fish with 2-3 boats up these rivers. But if you get like 10-15 guys up here, it gets really tough, and you may want to try to figure something else out. But hopefully that makes sense, guys. Hopefully this video was helpful and showed you some different types of areas that you could try in different lakes across the country to catch some fish in the fall. If you're really struggling in the fall and you're like, man, I cannot catch anything, I want to get out and catch fish, but every time I go out, I'm zeroing or have no consistency. Run up these rivers, check the areas I was talking about on your local lakes, and you will catch a bunch of fish. They may not be the biggest fish in the lake, but you're going to put some fish in the boat, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel. We'll see you all next one.